It's ironic, isn't it? He wins the World Championship, and that's the thing we talk about. Gary Anderson just really cashed in and sort of romped through the field. I still think the conversation of titles isn't completed yet.
Hello, welcome along to the story of here at the MODUS Super Series, where we look back at the career of some of the biggest and best players who have ever picked up a dart. Today, we're going to be having a look at the career and the story of the two-time world champion, the Flying Scotsman Gary Anderson, who ascended to the top of the sport by winning back-to-back world championship crowns in the years of 2015 and 2016, former winner of the World Match Play, former winner of the Premier League, World Cup, and numerous other major titles, while in a long and illustrious career. Matthew Edgar, didn't you hit a 170 against him once?
For the match. Something I bang on about a little bit, made the dartboard out of it. I think I make social media posts, YouTube videos about it every year on the anniversary of it. But there's a reason for that. And that is just the respect I have for Gary Anderson, who is, for me, one of the best 5 players of all time. That conversation comes around a lot. Who are the best 5 players to ever play this game? And I believe that the players are there. Just what order do you put them in? And every time I come up with that list, Gary Anderson is always in my top 5.
Okay, we'll go into his career in just a second. Why would you put him in that top 5? Because it's a weird one, Gary, because he was kind of, I suppose, maybe underappreciated because he was stuck between 2 eras where you got the Taylor era and the Van Gerwen era in the sport.
And rivaled them both. And longevity. You've got to look at a lot of factors when you look at the top players of all time. Yes, you can make it into a trophy comparison, but that's not fully what this is. And even if you do that, Gary Anderson rates quite highly on that top trumps card in regards to the titles he's won, certainly the back-to-back world championships. But the eras of which he played, the longevity, the crossover of eras, the fact he's still going now and still averaging around about 100 for the season, been statistically the best player in the world in 2024 and at the back end of 2023. So he's still got extremely high levels and gears in there. He's very feared in regards to the events. I think he's going to pick up more titles, and that's the thing that's exciting with Gary Anderson. And he's very flary, easy to watch, great player.
What makes him so special as a player?
From a fan's point of view, we like watching people who are flary, pacey, who play with freedom, who play with rhythm. Adrian Lewis, Michael Smith. Gary Anderson's always very high on that list in regards to people you just enjoy watching play. And then when you look at, I mean, we've got the I never practice version of Gary Anderson. Now, that's not true. Gary Anderson does practice, but he's not a practicer like, say, a Mervyn King, Connor Scott, people that will be there 3, 4, 5 hours before a darts match, people that will be putting in 5 to 8 hours worth of practice per day in order to eke out the most they can for themselves. Gary Anderson doesn't need that. Gary Anderson just needs 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there, and he relies on natural ability. And that is probably what makes him so special, because how many people in this sport have pure natural ability?
Which is possibly one of the reasons why he's had such longevity in the game. You think about his first appearances at the BDO World Championship, we're bordering on nearly 25 years ago now.
Longevity comes with simplicity. Again, let's draw some comparison. Steve Beaton, arguably one of the greatest in regards to longevity within this sport, has one of the most simple actions darts has ever seen. So easy, so enviable. Everyone said, I'd love to throw like Steve Beaton. He's the dream throw. Well, yeah. And there's a reason he's lasted so long. Gary Anderson, the same. There's a reason he's lasting so long. If he can play with natural ability and he doesn't need to practice all these hours, there's a lot less wear and tear. There's a lot less reps that are needed, which ultimately means the arms, if we've got so many miles out of it, he can put more of it into competitive play. So, yeah.
In terms of Gary's career, of course, he had the couple of world titles, but it never really started well for him at the World Championship. When he was playing in the BDO at the Lakeside, there's the infamous story of him throwing the darts in the lake, exits early on in the competition. The first part of his career, everybody knew how good Gary Anderson was, but when it came to that one big tournament in the year, it just never quite worked out for him initially, did it? It took him a few years to crack the code.
I think it's a hard system to play in, the BDO now WDF system. When you think about the sacrifice and the commitment you make all year long to get to that stage. And when you think about Gary Anderson back then, he wasn't an experienced Gary Anderson. He's not Gary Anderson now who's had a lot of time on TV. This is a player who played all year for that one opportunity, that one shot. And you build it up all year long, and then you get there and you need to produce over ultimately what is quite a short format in certainly modern day darts. So he also went there with a target on his back. People knew he was a scalp, and people knew he was one to beat. So I think the PDC really does suit Gary Anderson. The fact that you get that regular play, that regular time on TV. You got to think, when he was playing that, it wasn't like he'd played the Premier League for 16 weeks a year like he was doing in the PDC. It's not like he played the World Championship, the Match Play, the Grand Prix, European Championships, UK Open. You can sit here and reel off the opportunities. Then you put the World Series in there as well. Grand Slam of darts. You know, there's so many events now where you get in that time on TV. So you've got to remember what the BDO is and what the WDF is and what it was then as well. You know, it is essentially a stepping stone, a feeder system to sort of the big promotions now within darts. And it's a lot of people's first opportunity on the stage. We don't tend to see it the other way around, where people start off in sort of big promotion time darts and then drop down to it. It tends to be the other way, that we see people on the way up go in there. So I think those we can dismiss a little bit for Gary Anderson in those early stages, because that was when he was still in that development phase.
And you mentioned the word rivaling everywhere he went in his career. Even as a BDO player, you had the cross-code tournaments in the Netherlands for a few years, and then you had the Grand Slam of darts. Even as a BDO player in those events, he was pushing the big names, particularly Phil at the Grand Slam in the first year in 07 as a BDO player, pushed him very, very close.
There's always a moment where you realise you can do it. You think you can do it. You believe you can do it. But there's always something that stands out for you that makes you go, I can go and compete. We see it a lot of time, don't we, where a player will play in the Grand Slam, or certainly when it was PDC versus BDO, and they'd go and do all right, and then you knew they was going to switch, because they've just now seen that they can compete at that level. And this happens all the way through. Like, I was playing locally, and it was when I started practicing with Kevin Painter, who at the time was in the world's top 16. And I wasn't beating him, but I was getting close. And I thought, if I'm getting close to Kevin Painter, who's in the top 16 in the world, that means I could probably beat the players a bit further down. Certainly the ones outside the top 32. I'm going to be able to beat them if I'm challenging someone like... And there's those moments, those sort of eye-opening eureka moments. And we've seen it so many times, but I think with Gary Anderson, those really did sort of give him that belief, that natural ability. Because you've got to remember, this is an era where Phil Taylor was traditionally on TV, giving everyone the traditional Phil Taylor... I don't want to say nonsense, but the sort of blagging it, shall we say. I'm practicing 8 hours, I'm practicing 10 hours a day. No, he wasn't. And with that, when Gary Anderson's practicing 10 minutes, he's like, well, can I really compete with that if he's going to be on the board all the time, which was the mind games. And
then that led to the switch to the PDC in the late noughties, and it took him a couple of years to get going, but then once he did get going, he was an immovable object.
One of the greatest 5 players of all time. I said it at the start, and I'll say it probably many more times throughout this bit, that Gary Anderson, he earned that right. Now, during that period of time, to be on that list of the greatest 5 players of all time, you've got to have longevity, and you've got to have a peak or a prime that is a real note. And he's got both of those. That peak, that prime, what we're talking about there, those 2 back-to-back world championships, that's hard to do. It's something we haven't seen for a long time, and maybe we won't see again due to the depth within the sport, or certainly not for a long time anyway. And Gary Anderson's one of the rare people that has done that and gone back and defended that. A year's a long time in sport, so to win that title and go back a year later, that is one of the reasons why he's always going to be in that debate.
And then the breakthrough, the 2011 Premier League, his first real big triumph. And I suppose at that point, maybe not the expectation, the floodgates though, but you felt like that'd be the first of many for Gary.
I still feel like we haven't finished that conversation yet. I feel like this is a conversation we're having, not in the middle of his career. We are coming into the back end of it now. You know, age is becoming a factor for Gary Anderson. We know that he doesn't like to travel. He doesn't really do the Euro tours. He's done a couple, but he doesn't really like the Euro tours. We know he said he wouldn't accept a Premier League invite. So we know he's winding down. But even winding down, I still think the conversation of titles isn't completed yet. I think there's going to be another title in there. There's going to be another TV major for Gary Anderson, and I'm not even confident in saying one. I think it could be multiple.
And then there was a couple of lean years, wasn't there, for Gary? The couple of years just thereafter.
Yeah, and you know, this was sort of prime Gary Anderson. Michael Van Gerwen still talks about it now, doesn't he? That he really believes that Gary Anderson during that period of time was the only person that could rival him. And those two styles made some real good clashes. When you look at sort of the head-to-heads between the two, both pacey, both flary. But that's where we started to learn as well how Gary Anderson liked to play the game. Now, during that period of time, and certainly now, darts is changing in regards to the interactions that players have with the crowds or with the cameras. And that's where we got to learn a lot about Gary Anderson and the fact of how he perceives darts to be. And he's very old school. And I don't think we're ever going to change Gary Anderson in his approach to the sport. And with that, we got to learn that Gary is one of those head down, get on with it style of players. And boy, does he get on with it well.
Then you had the 2014 Players' Championship final. It was a few years since he last won a major tournament in the Premier League, and then he had that game, didn't he, against Phil Taylor? He'd then go on to win the tournament, and that felt like the real springboard for the success that he'd have the next month for Ali Pali.
We saw a bit of a tinkering during this period of time with Gary Anderson as well in regards to his equipment, and quite often when people start changing equipment, you start to look at it and go, is this someone on the decline, or is this someone looking for the extra %? Because quite a lot of the time, people will change at the point of crisis. When they lose confidence in the equipment, when they lose confidence in their throw, they'll then start to look for changes. Then they'll start to look for coaching. They start to look for answers to where their game is and why it's not the same. For Gary Anderson, it was completely different during that period of time. He was one of the brave people who, during that sort of good spell, go, right, how can I find a little bit more? Phil Taylor did it. Right, I'm on top of the world, but I want to be here for longer. How can I do this and change? Where that is when it's a positive switch. And we saw a few different versions, but ultimately he sort of went with the same sort of setup for him there. And he's been using that now for the last 10 years.
And then the maiden triumph of the World Championship, 2015. And look, we've got to talk about that final against Phil Taylor. Probably one of the greatest ever World Championship finals of all time. We'll talk about the crux of the game in just a second. But first and foremost, I suppose the most famous moment of that final are 3 darts of Gary's that didn't even hit the board.
It's ironic, isn't it? He wins a World Championship, and that's the thing we talk about. And, you know, that's how it tends to go. You know, Paul Hinks, how many games he refereed, and we all talk about the 1-2-7 in game. People tend to remember those mistakes and those slips. Not that it was a mistake, it was just one of those slips, one of those freak moments, one of those rare moments. We rarely see it. We've seen it, I think, once here at the Super Series in 104 matches a week. So 2 darts in the treble, the other one knocked it out. Now, I have seen this before. I've seen this on the Challenge Tour, where players hit it, knock the 3 darts out, and his opponent has gone up 3 darts and thrown them in the wall. Refused to take the advantage of that moment. Phil Taylor rubbed his hands together and said, "Thank you very much. I like that."
And then he won the World Championship. And you could see the emotion on his face. As we mentioned, he had his trials and his tribulations at the Lakeside. The PDC World Championship, he was coming close without going really deep in the competition. And you could just see that everything he worked for so long in a career had finally been fulfilled.
It's the hardest thing, isn't it? It's the hardest thing in the world. We're seeing it now with Michael Smith. We've seen it with many players before. When your whole life, and that's what this isn't a case of just going, I'm going to have a bit of a play at this. It's your whole life. It's the dedication, the sacrifice, not the normal lifestyle. Certainly not at home. Certainly not with your family. Not with your friends. That friendship circle diminishes very quickly. You know, certainly when I started playing darts myself on a professional basis, Loads of friends, loads of contacts. Certainly because beforehand I was wrestling, boxing, doing different things, so you build a big friendship circle. But then, can't come to your birthday this week, mate. I'm doing this. You've let someone down. They're not as interested no more. Oh, it's this event, that event. Can't make it. And what happens is the more you let people down because you've got to be selfish. I've got Pro Tour to go to. I've got this qualifier to go to. I've got this stuff. The friendship circle diminishes to about 1 or 2 people. And you do that and you sacrifice all this and that sacrifice of life to live this lifestyle that we're going to go and choose in the chase or the hope and the dream to have that moment that Gary Anderson had. And when you get that, then what? How do you wake up the next day when everything you wanted your entire life and everything you've worked towards and you've dedicated and sacrificed all these other things to funnel your life down this one road has happened? How do you wake up the next day and go, I might do that again?
Well, we saw that a little bit from Gary after winning the World Championship because he'd pick and choose his events, didn't play on the Euro Tour for the best part of a decade at a point. Since winning the World Championship, we hardly saw him at all on that particular tour. So Gary was somebody that once actually fulfilled that world title, he was happy to pick and choose events. Probably the first player in his guys really to, apart from maybe Phil, to really pick and choose what he wanted to play in.
Yeah, and I think this is where you get different attitudes and things. Phil Taylor woke up the next day after winning the World Championship and went, I want another one. And then he woke up after 15 and went, I want 16. After 16, I want 17. He was just very differently. I don't know if, personally speaking, if I won a World Championship, I don't think I could ever play darts again. How do you go to a Pro Tour? And when you think Gary Anderson won that, I think a Pro Tour was £500 for winning that first round game. How do you go from being on stage in front of millions, worldwide audience, winning the biggest prize in the sport, to then going and playing for £500? If in a sports hall with no crowd. Like, I don't know how you can do that, and it's so respectable and commendable for those people who can.
If 2015 was glory, Gary Anderson, as per the famous Rod Studd line, he'd go and do it again. He'd retain the world title against Adrian Lewis, of whom he had a fantastic rivalry with in his career.
Well, when you talk about games you'd love to see, we've talked about Gary Anderson and Michael van Gerwen. Gary Anderson, Adrian Lewis has that same appeal. Flair, pace, quality, big scoring, big power players. That's a game I could watch every day.
And then in terms of that rivalry with Michael, he played the world final the next year, lost to Michael. That was the best world championship performance probably from start to finish we ever saw from a player from Michael that year. But that really was a rivalry which transcended the sports. It was called El Clasico by some journalists and commentators. And you can understand why, because they were the 2 best players in the world at a time. And whenever they met, you knew something was going to happen.
We've always tend to have these, don't we? Back in the day, it used to be Phil Taylor and someone, Phil Taylor and someone, like Dennis Priestley, John Parr, different people coming to rival, Barneveld. For a period of time, it felt like Wayne Mardle was getting into that sort of rivalry, certainly when he switched over from the BDO. Now, when we look ahead, then it was Van Gerwen and insert player. I feel like we're getting that rivalry again now with Luke and Luke, but one of the things that was great when we look back at some of these rivalries and what made them so good is the sustainability of those rivalries. I don't feel like we've got that as such now, because those rivalries are switching very quickly. Michael van Gerwen, Luke Humphries, and it's Luke Humphries, Luke Littler. And it feels like we're bouncing. Gerwin Price has been in that conversation in recent times. There's this conversation going on all the time, isn't there? Who's the best player in the world? And it feels very flimsy in how quick it can change, which maybe just shows some of the depth. And when we go back to Gary, averaging nearly 100 for the year last year, didn't pick up one of those big titles. That would be unheard of years ago.
You could argue that perhaps one of his best years was one of the years he didn't win a World Championship, and that was 2018, where he won the UK Open behind closed doors in Minehead, beat Corey Cadby in the final, and then he would go on to win the World Match Play, and he, in that tournament, from start to finish, was quite simply put, unplayable.
That whole period of time, he was very, very good. I remember that UK Open well, because I think it's burnt in my memory.
The Beast from the East.
Oh, that was some tournament. And it was ironic, actually, because we was all advised not to travel. But You do. It's the UK Open. You're a senior player. You're going to go down. And I remember like that last little bit from Bridgewater to Minehead. Normally takes about an hour because it's twisty roads. It took us 5 hours to do about 20 miles to get to the UK Open. And I remember it so well. So we was in the back room. You go to the toilet. There was ice on the actual water. Because the pipes wasn't working. The pipes had frozen, so we wasn't getting the warm water. So on the first day, you'd seen players that week playing in hats, playing in gloves. I think it was Mark Walsh, wasn't he? Played in gloves, hat, and a hoodie. I think he actually got fined for that, actually, if I remember right.
Because it's not a collar,
is it? Yeah, because it wasn't a regulation wear. And players are wearing multiple layers, hand warmers in pockets. It was okay on day 2. Day 2, they got these big gas-powered fan heaters in there and sort of warmed up. So it was okay from day 2. But that first day was a challenge for everybody. And that's where you need your players that play on feel. Your players that can just play with freedom. If you look back at that event, you'll see a lot of people who have sort of manufactured or coached or heavily practice needed throws really struggle in that event, and Gary Anderson just really cashed in and sort of romped through the field.
How would you look back on, well, you said he's one of your top 5 of all time. How do you think Gary will look back on his career?
Well, Gary Anderson I don't think realises who Gary Anderson is or what Gary Anderson is in regards to this sport. I've sat at a table listening to conversation where Gary Anderson was contemplating just getting a skip because he was having a bit of a clear out and just throwing all this stuff in this. And people are like, what are you thinking? Throwing away this stuff? This is like memorabilia. This is like collectible stuff. Like people will pay £500,000 plus to own this piece of memorabilia, to put in a frame in the house. And he doesn't get it because he's like, I'm going to get a skip and have a clear out. It's like, don't do that. Like, this is very valuable stuff. And I don't think he realises quite what he's achieved because he's grown with the sport. He's sort of gone with it. So, and I can certainly speak from that, from being on the inside. When you're inside that bubble, you don't realise sort of the world that you're in. And when you come out of it, you realise and you look at it and you go, wow, actually there's a lot looking in. But when you're in looking out, you don't see what it really is. And Gary really is that guy that he doesn't realise what he's achieved.
Some career, that is for sure. Well, that is it for this week's edition of The Story of here on the MODUS Super Series channel on Pluto TV. Do stay tuned for more of these and our other dynamic darts content available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week here on Pluto TV.